In the early morning hours of June 9, 1944, a German soldier found himself crouching low in the hedgerows that lined a rural lane in Normandy. His name was Klaus Hartmann, an Oberfeldwebel serving with the 352nd Infantry Division, and in his trembling hands he held an American rifle. Just 3 days had passed since Allied forces had shattered through the Atlantic Wall, and the landscape of warfare was changing in ways Hartmann was only beginning to understand. The weapon he examined had been discovered beside the body of an American paratrooper, lying in a roadside ditch near the village of Saint-Mier-Église. This rifle was unlike anything Hartmann had encountered during his 5 years of military service. Its weight was considerable, nearly 10 pounds, and it featured a distinctive wooden stock along with an unusual en-bloc clip feeding system. However, what truly captured Hartmann's attention was not the rifle's appearance, but rather what he had witnessed during combat operations the previous day. During a skirmish that had erupted near the village church, Hartmann had observed something that defied his understanding of infantry combat. American soldiers, despite being outnumbered and pinned down by German fire, had returned volleys at an incomprehensible rate. These were not the measured, deliberate shots of trained marksmen that Hartmann knew from his own military experience. Instead, the Americans were firing as rapidly as they could pull their triggers, unleashing 8 rounds in rapid succession before reloading in what seemed like less than 2 seconds. The reloading process was accompanied by a distinctive metallic ping that echoed across the stone walls of the village buildings. Hartmann's military career had begun in 1939, and he had accumulated substantial combat experience across multiple theaters of war. He had participated in the invasion of Poland, fought during the 1940 campaign in France, and endured the brutal conditions of the Eastern Front, where winter temperatures reached lethal extremes. Throughout these campaigns, he had developed intimate knowledge of rifles and their capabilities. The Karabiner 98 Kurs, which served as the standard German infantry weapon, was as familiar to him as his own hands. He could operate its bolt-action MECHANISM while half asleep, cycle 5 rounds through its internal magazine with practiced efficiency, and accurately engage targets at distances of 300 meters or more. Hartmann considered himself proficient at his profession, yet during yesterday's engagements against American paratroopers armed with these unfamiliar semi-automatic rifles, he had experienced something entirely new to him. For the first time since the war had begun, he felt outgunned. The American soldiers had not demonstrated superior tactical skills or shown greater courage than German forces. They had simply possessed the ability to fire faster, substantially faster, so much faster that Hartmann's squad had been compelled to abandon positions they should have been able to hold according to standard tactical doctrine. That evening, Hartmann's company commander, Hauptmann Dieter, had assembled the survivors of the engagement and posed a question that revealed the depth of their collective confusion. How were the Americans managing to reload with such speed? Were they perhaps carrying multiple rifles into combat? Nobody among the assembled soldiers could provide an answer. The concept that a single infantryman could fire 8 rounds as rapidly as he could squeeze the trigger, without the need to work a bolt mechanism between shots, without the mechanical pauses that every rifleman in every army had been trained to exploit during combat, seemed to violate everything they understood about warfare. Now Hartmann held the physical evidence in his hands. This was the M1 Garand rifle, and it represented something for which the German army had made no preparations. It symbolized a fundamental transformation in infantry firepower, a transformation that would force German soldiers to reconsider everything they believed about rifle combat. The question facing them was not merely how this rifle functioned, though German engineers would soon dedicate considerable resources to understanding its mechanisms. The deeper and more troubling question, the one that would haunt German infantry commanders for the remainder of the war, was simpler yet more profound. Why had Germany not developed something comparable? Why, in a nation that took immense pride in its engineering excellence and military innovation, were German soldiers still operating their rifles using the same basic mechanisms their grandfathers had employed in 1914? To comprehend why the M1 Garand represented such a shocking revelation to German soldiers, one must first understand the weapon they carried and the military doctrine that surrounded it. The Karabiner 98 Kurs, commonly abbreviated as Kar 98K, was far more than simply a rifle. It represented the culmination of nearly half a century of German small arms development, a weapon system that embodied everything German military culture valued: precision engineering, mechanical reliability, and lethal effectiveness when wielded by a properly trained soldier. The rifle's lineage could be traced back to 1898, when the Gewehr 98 was officially adopted by the German Empire. That original design, created by the brothers Wilhelm and Paul Mauser, established principles that would dominate German rifle design for decades to come. It employed a bolt-action mechanism that was strong, reliable, and capable of safely handling powerful cartridges. The rifle featured an internal magazine that held 5 rounds, which kept the weapon's profile clean and well balanced. In skilled hands, it was capable of accurate fire at ranges exceeding 500 meters. Following Germany's defeat in the First World War, the Treaty of Versailles imposed severe restrictions on German military forces. Despite these limitations, rifle development continued to evolve. In 1935, as Germany began rearming under the Nazi regime, the Wehrmacht adopted the Karabiner 98 Kurs. This weapon was essentially the Gewehr 98 with a shortened barrel, incorporating various modifications that had been learned during the Great War. The K in its designation stood for Kurs, meaning short in German, though at 43 inches in length and weighing just over 8 pounds, it was hardly a compact weapon by modern standards. The Kar 98K fired the 7.92 by 57mm Mauser cartridge, a powerful round with a muzzle velocity of approximately 2,400 feet per second. This gave the rifle excellent range and penetration capabilities against various targets. A trained German infantryman could fire 15 to 28 rounds per minute with the Kar 98K, smoothly cycling the bolt between shots. Exceptional soldiers, those with thousands of rounds of practice behind them, might achieve 25 rounds per minute in sustained fire, though accuracy would inevitably suffer at such rates. The German Army's rifle training program was exhaustive and comprehensive. Recruits spent weeks learning to operate the bolt action smoothly, to maintain consistent pressure on the trigger between shots, to work the 5-round stripper clips that loaded the internal magazine efficiently. They learned to estimate range accurately, to adjust their sights for different distances, to account for wind and elevation when engaging targets. German military doctrine emphasized marksmanship because the rifle was considered a precision instrument. A well-trained infantryman was expected to reliably hit man-sized targets at 300 meters and to engage targets at 500 meters or beyond when conditions permitted. This training philosophy reflected a broader German military culture that placed high value on individual skill and professional competence. The German soldier was expected to be technically proficient with his weapon, to thoroughly understand its capabilities and limitations, to function as part of a combined arms team where rifles, machine guns, mortar, and artillery each had clearly defined roles. The rifle was designated for aimed, effective fire against specific targets. The machine gun, particularly the MG-34 and later the even more formidable MG-42, was assigned the role of suppressive fire and area denial. This division of labor made sound tactical sense within the framework of German doctrine. The MG-42 could fire up to 1,500 rounds per minute, an astonishing rate that gave German infantry squads tremendous firepower. The rifle did not need to match that rate because it served a different purpose, also German doctrine taught. While Germany refined the bolt-action rifle to what many considered its ultimate expression, the United States pursued a fundamentally different philosophy regarding infantry weapons. American military planners, studying the lessons of the First World War, reached a different conclusion about the nature of infantry firepower. They believed that volume of fire mattered more than individual marksmanship by extended ranges. They wanted every rifleman to possess the capability to deliver sustained rapid fire without the mechanical limitation of working a bolt between shots. The man who would solve this engineering challenge was John M1 Garand, a Canadian-born firearms designer who had immigrated to the United States and found employment at the Springfield Armory in Massachusetts. Garand was largely self-taught. As an engineer, possessing an intuitive understanding of mechanical systems that formal education might not have provided. In 1919, shortly after the First World War concluded, he began working on a semi-automatic rifle design that would eventually bear his name. The development process would consume 17 years of his life. Garand tested numerous operating systems, experimented with different gas systems, and continuously refined the feeding mechanism. The central challenge was creating a rifle that would remain reliable under actual battlefield conditions, including exposure to dirt, mud, and extreme temperatures, while maintaining acceptable accuracy and being simple enough for mass production at scale. By 1936, Garand had succeeded in meeting these demanding requirements. The United States Army officially adopted the M1 rifle, its standard infantry weapon, making it the first nation to equip its entire infantry force with a semi-automatic rifle. The M1 Garand was revolutionary in several significant ways. It was semi-automatic, meaning it automatically ejected the spent cartridge case and loaded a fresh round from the magazine with each trigger pull. The soldier only needed to pull the trigger again to fire the next shot. There was no bolt to work, no manual cycling required between shots, just aim and shoot 8 times as rapidly as the trigger could be pulled. The rifle used an N-block clip system that held 8 rounds of 30-06 Springfield ammunition, the same powerful cartridge the United States had used during the First World War. When the 8th round was fired, the empty clip ejected automatically with that distinctive metallic ping, and the action locked open, clearly signaling to the soldier that it was time to reload. Reloading took approximately 2 seconds for a properly trained soldier. The process involved inserting a fresh clip, pushing it down until it clicked into place, and the bolt would automatically release to chamber the first round. The soldier was immediately ready to fire another 8 rounds. The M1 weighed 9.5 pounds when fully loaded, making it slightly heavier than the Karabiner 8K. It measured 43.5 inches in length, nearly identical to the German rifle. However, in terms of actual firepower delivered to the battlefield, there is simply no comparison between the two weapons. A trained American soldier could fire 40 to 50 aimed rounds per minute with the M1 Garand, more than double the rate achievable by a soldier equipped with a bolt-action rifle. Critically, this was sustained fire, not merely a brief burst. As long as the soldier had ammunition and fresh clips available, he could maintain this rate of fire indefinitely. The United States began mass production of the M1 in 1937, Springfield Armory, and at the Winchester Repeating Arms Company. By the time the United States entered the war in December 1941, hundreds of thousands of these rifles had already been produced. Production would eventually reach approximately 4 million rifles by war's end, with Springfield and Winchester being joined by additional contractors, including International Harvester and Harrington and Richardson. When American forces first engaged German troops in North Africa during late 1942 and early 1943, German soldiers encountered the M1 Garand for the first time in actual combat conditions. Initial reports were scattered and often dismissed by higher command. Combat is inherently chaotic, and distinguishing one type of rifle fire from another amid the cacophony of machine guns, mortar, and artillery is extremely difficult. However, as the fighting continued through Tunisia, then Sicily, and then Italy, certain patterns began to emerge in German after-action reports that could not be easily dismissed. American infantry squads appeared to be generating more rifle fire than German intelligence had expected. They were sustaining fire for longer periods during engagements. They seemed to have access to more ammunition or were somehow reloading faster than German intelligence had anticipated. These observations, initially dismissed as exaggerations or misunderstandings, began to accumulate until they could no longer be ignored. The first systematic German analysis of captured M1 Garand rifles occurred during the spring of 1943. Wehrmacht ordnance officers in Tunisia, preparing to evacuate as Allied forces closed in on their positions, made arrangements to ship several captured American weapons back to the Heereswaffenamt, the Army Weapons Agency in Berlin. Among these weapons were multiple M1 Garands in various conditions, ranging from nearly pristine rifles taken from captured supply depots to battle-worn examples recovered from the battlefield. The weapons arrived at the testing facility in Kummersdorf, located south of Berlin. In May 1943, engineers from the Heereswaffenamt subjected them to the same rigorous evaluation procedures they applied to all foreign weapons captured during the war. They completely disassembled the rifles, carefully measuring tolerances, examining metallurgy, and testing the gas operating system under various environmental conditions. What they discovered was both impressive and deeply troubling from a military perspective. The M1 Garand used a gas-operated system where a portion of the propellant gases from firing were diverted through a port in the barrel to drive a piston that cycled the action. This concept was not entirely new. French and Soviet designers had used similar systems in their own semi-automatic rifle designs. However, Garand's specific implementation was remarkably reliable. The rifle continued to function properly in mud, sand, extreme cold, and with minimal maintenance. German testers fired thousands of rounds through the captured rifles, deliberately neglecting cleaning and maintenance procedures, and the weapons continued to function reliably. The N-block clip system, which had initially been viewed as a potential weakness by German engineers, proved surprisingly practical in testing. Each clip held 8 rounds and could be loaded into the rifle with a single motion. The clip fed rounds up into the chamber as the action cycled, and upon firing the last round, the empty clip ejected automatically. German testers carefully measured reload times and found that a moderately trained soldier could reload the M1 in under 3 seconds, often in just 2 seconds. By comparison, reloading a Kar 98K with stripper clips took 4 to 6 seconds to load just 5 rounds. The mathematics were damning when analyzed objectively. In a 1-minute engagement, a German soldier with a Kar 98K could fire approximately 20 aimed rounds, assuming good conditions and well-practiced technique. An American soldier with an M1 Garand could fire 40 to 50 aimed rounds in the same period. The American possessed 2.5 times the firepower of the German, and this calculation was per individual soldier, not per squad. A 10-man American rifle squad, all armed with M1 Garands, could generate 400 to 500 rounds per minute of aimed rifle fire. A 10-man German rifle squad, with 8 men carrying Kar 98K rifles and 2 men with submachine guns, could generate perhaps 200 rounds per minute, and much of that submachine gun fire would be inaccurate beyond 50 meters. The report compiled by the Heereswaffenamt acknowledged the M1's clear superiority as an infantry weapon, but noted several significant concerns about adopting a similar design for German military service. The rifle required precision manufacturing with tight tolerances. It used substantially more steel and required more machining time than the Kar 98K. Most critically, from a strategic perspective, it consumed ammunition at rates that German logistics infrastructure could not sustain. This last point deserves particular emphasis and detailed examination. The German Army's ammunition production and distribution system had been designed around bolt-action rifles that fired 15 to 20 rounds per minute. The entire supply chain, from factories to forward depots to individual soldiers, assumed each infantryman would carry 60 rounds in his ammunition pouches and perhaps 20 additional rounds in reserve. Battles were expected to last hours or at most a few days before units would withdraw to refit and resupply. Semi-automatic rifles would consume ammunition at rates 2 to 3 times faster, requiring proportional increases in production capacity, transportation infrastructure, and forward distribution networks. Germany's industrial capacity, already strained by enormous demands for artillery shells, machine gun ammunition, and tank production, could not easily absorb this additional burden. The logistics of supplying armies fighting simultaneously in Russia, North Africa, and Western Europe were already stretching German capabilities to their limits. Adding the requirement to produce and distribute 2 to 3 times as much rifle ammunition would have created cascading effects throughout the entire military-industrial system. German ordnance officials faced an uncomfortable reality that no amount of engineering expertise could resolve. They understood clearly that the M1 Garand was superior to the Kar 8K almost every tactical situation that infantry might encounter. They recognized that American infantry armed with these rifles possessed a significant and measurable advantage in firepower. However, they also understood with equal clarity that Germany could not replicate this advantage, not because German engineers lacked the technical knowledge or capability to design comparable weapons, but because Germany's industrial and logistical systems simply could not support widespread adoption of such weapons at the scale required. The Gewehr 41, a semi-automatic rifle that had been designed before the war, had been produced in limited numbers but proved too complex and unreliable for mass issue to regular infantry units. The Gewehr 43, an improved semi-automatic rifle introduced in 1943, would eventually see wider distribution among German forces, but production never exceeded 400,000 rifles over a 2-year period. By comparison, American factories produced 4 million M1 Garands. The ratio was 10 to 1, and even that stark figure understates the true disparity, because the Gewehr 43 went primarily to specialized troops and elite units, while every American infantryman, rifleman, and even many support personnel carried the M1 as standard equipment. The theoretical understanding of the M1 Garand's superiority, documented in engineering reports and staff analyses, became visceral reality for German soldiers in the hedgerows of Normandy. The bocage, as the French called this distinctive landscape, consisted of agricultural land divided by ancient earthen banks topped with dense hedgerows. These natural barriers, some dating back centuries, created a landscape of small fields separated by walls of earth, stone, and thick vegetation. The hedgerows were formidable obstacles, often 6 to 8 feet tall, thick enough to stop vehicles, and providing excellent cover for defending troops. German forces, particularly those of the 7th Army defending Normandy, had prepared extensive defensive positions throughout the bocage. They understood that the terrain strongly favored the defender. Each field became a potential killing ground. Each hedgerow concealed machine gun nests, mortar positions, and rifle pits. German doctrine called for small groups of soldiers to defend each hedgerow, falling back to the next defensive line when pressed, creating a defense in depth that theoretically would slow any Allied advance to a crawl. In theory, this defensive strategy should have worked effectively. German soldiers were well trained, experienced from years of war, and fighting from carefully prepared positions. American forces attacking across open fields toward fortified hedgerows should have suffered heavy casualties according to conventional military wisdom. However, the reality proved more complex, and the M1 Garand played a significant role in that complexity. when American infantry advanced across a Norman field toward a German-held hedgerow. They did not advance in neat lines as First World War doctrine would have prescribed. They moved in small groups, using fire and maneuver tactics. One group would provide covering fire while another moved forward. The volume of fire they could generate was extraordinary by any measure. 8 American soldiers, each armed with an M1 Garand, could put nearly 400 rounds downrange at a single minute when firing aggressively. This was not aimed precision fire at distant targets. This was suppressive fire designed to keep German defenders' heads down while other Americans maneuvered closer to the objective. German soldiers in defensive positions found themselves pinned down by this overwhelming volume of fire. A German machine gun team possessed superior firepower in theory. The MG-42 could fire 1,500 rounds per minute under ideal conditions. However, in practice, they could not keep their weapon in action under sustained rifle fire from multiple directions simultaneously. The gunner needed to expose himself to aim and fire effectively. If 8 American riflemen were all directing fire at his position, one or more bullets would inevitably find him or force him to take cover, effectively silencing the machine gun. The Americans could sustain this volume of fire longer than the Germans could endure it. Unteroffizier Hermann Schaefer, a squad leader in the 353rd Infantry Division, wrote in a letter to his wife in July 1944 about his experience fighting in the bocage. The letter was intercepted by Allied intelligence and translated into English for analysis. Schaefer described an engagement where his squad of 9 men had occupied a hedgerow position with good fields of fire across an open field. American infantry had begun advancing across that field toward their position. Schaefer's men had opened fire with their Kar 98K rifles and one MG-40 machine gun. They had hit several Americans in their initial volley, dropping them in the open field. Then the American return fire had begun in earnest. Schaefer wrote that the volume of incoming rifle fire was unlike anything he had experienced during the war, and he had fought in Russia, where combat had been extraordinarily intense. The Americans were not firing in disciplined volleys, as German training manuals described. They were firing continuously, as fast as they could aim and pull the trigger. His machine gunner had been hit in the head within the first minute of the engagement. 2 of his riflemen had been wounded by the sustained incoming fire. The Americans had not charged forward in a mass assault. They had not needed to charge. They had simply kept shooting, maintaining continuous fire until Schaefer ordered his surviving men to fall back to the next hedgerow position. Schaefer estimated that the engagement had lasted perhaps 5 minutes from beginning to end. His squad had fired perhaps 300 rounds total during that time. He believed, based on the volume and intensity of fire his position had received, that the Americans had fired well over 1,000 rounds during the same engagement. This pattern of American firepower superiority repeated itself across Normandy throughout June, July, and August of 1944. German after-action reports compiled at division and corps level consistently noted and commented on the extraordinary volume of American rifle fire encountered during engagements. Some reports attributed this phenomenon to unlimited ammunition supplies, assuming Americans simply carried more ammunition than German intelligence had estimated. Others speculated that American squads were equipped with more automatic weapons than German intelligence reports indicated. A few perceptive officers, those willing to challenge assumptions, recognized the truth. The Americans had equipped every single rifleman with a semi-automatic weapon, and this fundamental difference in basic equipment was tilting small unit engagements decisively in American favor. The psychological effect of facing an enemy with superior small arms firepower was cumulative and corrosive to morale over time. German soldiers had entered the war confident in their training, their equipment, and their tactical doctrine. That confidence had been earned through impressive victories in Poland, France, the Balkans, and during the early campaigns in Russia. The German army had established a formidable reputation for tactical excellence, for being able to achieve more with less, for winning through superior training and leadership even when outnumbered or outgunned in other areas. However, confidence erodes steadily when the fundamental tools of your trade are demonstrably inferior to those of your enemy. A German infantryman knew his Karabiner 8K was an excellent rifle by any objective measure. It was accurate, reliable, and powerful. However, he also knew through direct personal experience that in a firefight with American infantry, he could not generate the same volume of fire as his opponents. He would fire his 5 rounds, work the bolt smoothly between each shot, reload with stripper clips, and repeat the process. Meanwhile, the American soldier facing him would fire 8 rounds as rapidly as he could pull the trigger, reload into seconds, and fire 8 more rounds. This was not a matter of courage or training or tactical skill, qualities that German soldiers possessed in abundance. This was purely a matter of mechanical capability. The German soldier was not failing at his task. His weapon was simply slower by design. In combat, where fractions of a second often determine who shoots first and who dies, slower meant more dangerous to the operator. German soldiers developed a healthy respect for the M1 Garand's distinctive sound signature. The semi-automatic fire, faster than bolt action, but slower and more deliberate than machine gun fire, had a particular rhythm that experienced soldiers learned to recognize. Veteran German troops learned to identify this sound and to take cover immediately upon hearing it. They also learned to listen carefully for the metallic ping of the en-bloc clip ejecting, which signaled that the American rifleman was reloading and would be vulnerable for approximately 2 seconds. Some German training manuals actually instructed soldiers to count shots fired and to attack during the brief reload interval. Though this tactical advice was considerably easier to teach in training than to execute under the stress and chaos of actual combat, the most demoralizing aspect of this situation was not merely the tactical disadvantage, significant though that was. The most demoralizing aspect was the growing realization that German industry and military leadership had failed to provide equivalent weapons to their soldiers. German soldiers knew that their nation took immense pride in technological superiority. They had been told repeatedly through propaganda that German engineering was the finest in the world, that German weapons were superior to enemy equipment in every category. In many cases, this propaganda was actually true rather than mere boasting. The MG-40 machine gun was arguably the best general-purpose machine gun of the entire war. German tanks, particularly the Panther and Tiger models, were formidable weapons that Allied forces learned to fear and respect. German artillery was effective and well coordinated with infantry operations. However, the basic rifle, the weapon that every infantryman carried into battle, the weapon that he depended upon for a personal survival, was fundamentally a design from the previous century. It was refined, perfected even within its design parameters, but it was still fundamentally a bolt-action rifle in an era when the enemy had moved decisively to semi-automatic fire. This created profound cognitive dissonance for German soldiers. How could Germany be technologically superior when its soldiers carried inferior rifles compared to their enemies? Some soldiers rationalized this disparity by focusing on ammunition consumption. The semi-automatic rifle used significantly more ammunition, they reasoned, and Germany was fighting a desperate war on multiple fronts with increasingly limited resources. It made strategic sense to equip soldiers with weapons that were adequate for their task and conserved ammunition rather than weapons that were superior but logistically demanding. This rationalization had genuine merit. Germany's ammunition production and distribution capabilities were indeed severely constrained by 1944. However, it was also an excuse that did not change the tactical reality that in direct firefights, Americans could shoot faster and more often than other soldiers, particularly those who had been in military service since the war's beginning, remembered that Germany had actually developed semi-automatic rifles before the war began. The Gewehr 41 had been issued in small numbers to certain units. The Gewehr-43 was now being produced, though in quantities far too limited to equip all infantry formations. Some soldiers began quietly questioning why these weapons had not been prioritized earlier in the war, why production had focused so heavily on other weapon systems. These questions, asked quietly among trusted comrades rather than voiced openly, revealed an erosion of faith in military leadership's judgments and priorities. The broader impact of this firepower disparity extended beyond individual psychology to affect tactical doctrine itself. German infantry tactics had been built around the fundamental assumption that both sides would be using bolt-action rifles with comparable rates of fire. Small unit tactics emphasized maneuver, fire and movement, and combined arms coordination. These remained valid principles, but they became significantly harder to execute effectively when the enemy could generate twice the rifle fire. German squads found themselves needing to rely more heavily on their machine guns, on mortar support, and on artillery because their riflemen were consistently outgunned in direct engagements. German military leadership at the highest levels recognized the problem clearly but could not solve it at the scale required. The Gewehr-43 resented Germany's serious attempt to field a semi-automatic rifle comparable to the M1 Garand. Development had begun in earnest in 1941 as the German forces on the Eastern Front encountered Soviet semi-automatic rifles, particularly the Tokarev SVT-40. The Gewehr-43, introduced to limited service in 1943, was a reasonably effective weapon by most measures. It used a gas-operated system similar to the Soviet Tokarev, fired the same 7.9 2mm Mauser cartridge as the Kar-98K, and featured a 10-round detachable box magazine. However, production remained severely limited by industrial capacity constraints and competing priorities for resources. The Volta factory in Zelemelis produced the majority of Gewehr-43 rifles, manufacturing approximately 400,000 between 1943 and 1945. This sounds like a substantial number until compared directly to the 4 million M1 Garands produced by American factories during roughly the same period, or to the 14 million Kar-98K rifles produced by German and occupied factories throughout the entire war. The Gewehr-43 went primarily to specialized units rather than regular infantry formations. Panzer Grenadier divisions, the mechanized infantry that worked closely with tank formations, received priority for these weapons. Elite infantry divisions on critical fronts received allocations. Snipers used accurized versions fitted with telescopic sights. However, the average German infantryman, the Lanzer holding a sector in France or Italy or defending ground in the east, continued to carry the Kar-98K. He would carry it until the war ended or until he could no longer carry anything at all. The allocation decisions reflected Germany's deteriorating strategic situation with brutal clarity. By 1943 and 1944, Germany was fighting a purely defensive war on multiple fronts simultaneously. Industrial production focused necessarily on tanks, aircraft, and ammunition for these systems. Steel, machine tools, and skilled labor were all finite resources that could not be stretched indefinitely. Every Gewehr-43 produced meant resources that were not available for producing other weapons or equipment. German planners made the cold calculation that limited numbers of semi-automatic rifles distributed to elite units provided more overall military value than attempting to re-equip the entire infantry force with new weapons while production capacity remained limited. This calculation was probably correct given Germany's severe constraints and desperate situation, but it meant that the vast majority of German infantry would fight the remainder of the war with bolt-action rifles while facing enemies American, British, and increasingly Soviet forces who were equipped with semi-automatic weapons as standard issue. The disparity in small arms firepower would remain constant until the war's end. a permanent tactical disadvantage that German soldiers would simply have to accept and work around as best they could. German soldiers adapted their tactics, wherever possible within these constraints. Units fortunate enough to be equipped with the Gewehr 43 used them aggressively, positioning these soldiers where their higher rate of fire would prove most valuable. Squad tactics came to emphasize the machine gun even more heavily than before, with riflemen functioning primarily to support and protect the machine gun team, rather than serving as primary sources of firepower themselves. German infantry became increasingly defensive-minded, preferring to fight from carefully prepared positions where fields of fire could be controlled and where the advantages of semi-automatic rifles could be partially negated by superior positioning and combined arms support. However, adaptation had definite limits. In meeting engagements, where forces encountered each other unexpectedly without prepared positions, in situations where rapid maneuver and quick reaction determined outcomes, the side with superior firepower held a decisive advantage. American forces, particularly in the final year of the war, grew increasingly confident in their ability to win small unit engagements. This confidence was built partly on accumulated experience and improved training, but it was also built solidly on the knowledge that they possessed better tools for the job. The captured M1 Garands that German soldiers occasionally managed to acquire and use in combat became highly prized possessions, despite the risks and complications. Soldiers who recovered these rifles from American casualties or from captured supply drops would sometimes carry them in preference to their officially issued Kar-9 8K rifles. Despite regulations explicitly against using enemy weapons, the risk was significant on multiple levels. Using an M1 Garand meant that the soldier could potentially be mistaken for an American by his own side, particularly if heard, but not seen during combat. Using enemy weapons violated military regulations and could result in disciplinary action. However, some soldiers accepted these considerable risks because the rifle's firepower advantage was simply worth it in their judgment. German officers generally looked the other way when soldiers under their command carried captured M1 Garands, tacitly recognizing that the practice improved their unit's combat effectiveness. Even it complicated logistics and identification procedures. Ammunition was the primary practical constraint on this practice. The M1 fired the 30-06 Springfield cartridge, which was completely incompatible with German weapons and ammunition supply systems. Soldiers using captured Garands depended entirely on capturing American ammunition as well, which meant their weapons would eventually become useless when ammunition supplies ran out. Still, for short-term combat effectiveness, many soldiers judged that the advantages outweighed the substantial problems.